The wind howled across the Wyoming plains like a hungry spirit. It battered the sturdy walls of Gideon Croft's isolated ranch house, rattling the windows in their frames, but the home he'd built with his own hands held firm. Inside, a fire in the stone hearth cast a warm, dancing light, throwing long shadows across his weathered face. Gideon sat near the flames, a sharp knife in his hand, meticulously carving another wooden horse. Always horses. They were the only creatures that seemed to grasp the silence he lived in. At 39, Gideon carried the weight of a much older man. His dark hair was long and streaked with premature gray, his beard thick and untrimmed. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held the ghosts of years defined by loss. 15 winters had come and gone since Abigail, his wife, and their stillborn son were lost to a fever that swept through their homestead. In the years that followed, Gideon buried more than just their bodies, he buried the hopeful man he once was. The ranch house was modest, a single large room with a loft for sleeping. He had felled the timber and raised the walls himself, a monument to his solitude. A ladder provided access to the loft, where he slept on a simple mattress under a pile of thick wool blankets. Below, the space was filled with practicalities, a heavy wooden table, 2 chairs, shelves laden with cured meats, dried herbs, and jars of preserved vegetables. A pair of rifles rested on pegs above the door, always within reach. Outside in the lean-to stable, his powerful stallion, Fury, stamped and shifted, the only living being Gideon allowed himself to trust. The storm outside had escalated into a full-blown blizzard, a blinding curtain of white that erased the world. Gideon was no stranger to these tempests. White Death, the old-timers called them. They were blizzards that could swallow a wagon train whole, burying travelers so deep they wouldn't be found until the spring thaw. He tossed another log onto the fire, the crackle and pop a comforting counterpoint to the wind's tormented scream. For Gideon, storms were a simple matter of endurance. He had provisions, firewood, and fury. He had no one else to worry about, and that was precisely how he'd built his life. Alone. Insulated. Safe. But then, a sound pierced the storm's roar. At first, he dismissed it as a trick of the wind, a phantom cry in the gale. He froze, his head cocked, every nerve ending tingling. There it was again, faint and fragile, but unmistakably human. Gideon's jaw tightened. Every instinct screamed at him to ignore it, to stay by his fire and let the blizzard claim whatever poor soul was caught in its teeth. He'd learned the hard way that caring was a path to ruin. And yet, before he could argue himself out of it, he was pulling on his heavy boots. He wrapped his sheepskin coat around his shoulders and stepped out into the maelstrom. Snow lashed at his face, a stinging, blinding assault. Fury whinnied from the stable, a low, anxious sound, as if to warn him against his own compassion. Gideon paid it no mind. He pushed forward, his rifle strapped to his back, heading toward the faint outline of the old stage road. The trail was nearly invisible, but Gideon knew this land like the back of his own hand. He pushed through waist-deep drifts, each step a monumental effort. Then he saw it. A stagecoach, tilted on its side like a child's discarded toy, already half-swallowed by a snowdrift. One of its wheels spun lazily, a final, futile gesture. The horses were still in their harnesses, frozen sculptures of their last panic moments. The driver was slumped over the seat, his neck bent at an unnatural angle. Mail and packages lay scattered, their bright colors a stark contrast to the unforgiving white. Gideon's stomach clenched. Death was an old acquaintance, but this scene felt wrong. It felt as if the coach had been fleeing something even before the storm had caught it. He heard it again, a sound so soft he almost missed it. A whimper. Dropping to his knees, Gideon began to claw at the snow with his bare hands, the cold burning his skin. Finally, his fingers brushed against fabric. Dark silk, embroidered and fine, not the sturdy wool of frontier women. He dug with renewed urgency, his breath clouding in the frigid air. A gloved hand appeared, slender and pale. Then, he cleared the snow from her face. A young woman was curled in the drift, her black hair a tangled mess, her silk tunic torn and soaked. Her skin was the color of porcelain, her lips a faint, chilling blue. Clothes made for a different world, useless against the brutal Wyoming winter. He pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck, expecting the cold stillness of death. But then he felt it. A thread of a pulse, faint but there. She was alive. Gideon stared down at her, a war raging inside him. He could leave her. He should leave her. This woman was a complication he could not afford. Complications led to attachment, and attachment led to loss. He had sworn to himself, never again. But his arms were already moving, lifting her from her snowy grave. She was impossibly light, as fragile as a sparrow, her head lolling against his shoulder. With considerable effort, Gideon mounted Fury, settling her in front of him, pressing her frozen body against his own for warmth. He urged the stallion onward, back up the treacherous path, fighting through drifts that reached the horse's chest. Every single step was a struggle. The woman's breaths were shallow, growing weaker with every passing minute. Gideon held her tighter, cursing his own weakness. He didn't want this. He didn't need this. But a deeper truth gnawed at him: he could not have left her there to die. Hours later, they stumbled back into the sanctuary of the ranch house. Gideon gently laid her on the rug before the fire. Her silk clothes were a death sentence, cold and wet. His hands, usually so steady, trembled as he began to unfasten the intricate knots of her dark blue tunic. It felt like a violation, but survival had no room for propriety. He wrapped her shivering form in a heavy wool blanket, threw more wood on the fire until it roared, and hung her clothes near the hearth to dry. A healthy pink began to creep back into her cheeks, though her eyes remained closed. Her damp hair spread across the blanket, and a faint, exotic scent of jasmine filled the small house. Gideon sat back on his heels, watching her. His carefully constructed solitude had been shattered. The walls he had spent 15 years building were already showing cracks. Hours crawled by before she finally stirred. A soft moan escaped her lips, and then her eyes fluttered open. They were dark, almond-shaped, and startlingly beautiful. Her gaze swept the room in confusion before landing on him. Pure terror ignited in her eyes. She screamed, a raw, sharp sound, clutching the blanket to her throat as she scrambled backward. "You are safe," Gideon said, his voice a low rumble, rough from lack of use. He held up his hands to show he meant no harm. "Your coach crashed in the storm. The others, they didn't make it. I found you." Her terrified gaze darted to her clothes drying by the fire, and a new wave of horror washed over her. "What did you eat? You were freezing to death," he cut in, his tone firm but not unkind. "I did what had to be done." Tears welled in her dark eyes as she whispered names he didn't know. Mr. Song, Mrs. Chen, Little Wei. Gideon could only shake his head. None had survived. Her grief erupted like a flash flood, a storm of raw, ragged sobs. Gideon stood by, a helpless observer, the scene a painful echo of his own past, of graves dug in frozen earth. But at least she had a witness to her sorrow. He had mourned alone. When her sobs finally subsided into shuddering breaths, she wiped her face with a trembling hand. "I am Mai Lin," she said, her voice quiet but dignified. Widow of Jian Li. Her dark eyes studied him, weary but no longer terrified. "Who are you?" "Gideon Croft." "How long?" she asked, "until the storm passes?" "Until we can get to a town." Gideon glanced at the window, where the snow continued its relentless assault. "This storm's not done with us. Could be days. Maybe a week." Her lips quivered. "A week? That is impossible. This is Wyoming," Gideon said with grim simplicity. "The storms here don't care about what's possible." Mai Lin pulled the blanket tighter around her. She was trapped in the wilderness with a stranger. A man who had saved her, but whose eyes warned her to keep her distance. This was no place for a woman like her, and he was no man to be trifled with. Fate had thrown them together in this small house on the edge of nowhere, and neither of them could guess what the storm would bring next. The blizzard showed no sign of abating. Snow drifted higher against the ranch house, and the wind moaned through the eaves like a lonely ghost. Gideon sat at his table, honing the blade of his knife with slow, rhythmic strokes. Across the room, My Lin sat by the fire, wrapped in the wool blanket as if it were a suit of armor. Her dark eyes followed his every movement. "Your clothes should be dry by morning," Gideon said at last, his voice still gravelly. "I'll find you something to wear until then." My Lin straightened her posture. "You have done too much already." "I will manage." "You won't manage in wet silk," he stated flatly. He rose, walked to a large wooden trunk at the foot of his loft ladder, and lifted the heavy lid. A faint scent of lavender and cedar escaped. He pulled out a patched but clean flannel shirt and a pair of sturdy wool trousers. He placed them on a chair near her. "They belong to my wife. They'll be large on you, but they'll be warm." For a long moment, she stared at the clothes, a silent acknowledgement of the ghost between them. Then she looked at him. "Turn your back," she commanded, her voice soft but firm. Gideon grunted in assent and moved to the door, checking the heavy latch as the storm hammered against it. Behind him, he heard the rustle of the blanket, the whisper of fabric, a soft intake of breath as she dressed in the unfamiliar garments. He thought of Abigail, of the last time he'd seen a woman moving in this house. A familiar ache tightened in his chest, and he forced it down. When My Lin spoke again, her voice held a new resolve. "You live here completely alone?" 15 years, Gideon replied, his back still to her. "No family?" "No one." "No one, and this is how you prefer it?" He turned to face her then. She looked small and lost in Abigail's clothes, the sleeves rolled up multiple times, the trousers cinched with a piece of rope. But her bearing was proud, her chin held high. "It's better to be alone than to dig graves," he said, the words falling like stones in the quiet room. His stark statement silenced her, but not for long. "You rescued me. You could have left me in the snow." "That does not sound like a man who truly wishes to be alone." Gideon's gaze hardened. "Don't confuse a basic instinct with kindness. A coyote will drag a wounded rabbit from a trap, too. But not to save it." If My Lin's breath hitched. His warning hung between them, a clear and deliberate boundary. Yet, in her eyes, he saw not just fear but a flicker of defiance. Later, as he stirred a pot of rabbit stew over the fire, My Lin approached the mantel, her attention caught by the line of carved horses. She reached out a delicate hand, her fingertips tracing the flowing lines of a stallion rearing up. "You made these?" Gideon didn't look up from the pot. "Helps pass the time. They are beautiful," she said, picking one up. So much life in them. She turned the small wooden figure over in her hands. "Why horses?" "Because they understand," he grunted. "Understand what?" "That you can run with a herd, but in the end, you stand on your own 4 feet." The heavy silence settled over the room, broken only by the bubbling stew and the ceaseless howl of the wind. My Lin held the small carving as if it were a precious jewel. Gideon watched her from the corner of his eye, disturbed by how easily she seemed to fit into the space by his hearth. When the stew was ready, he ladled a bowl for her. She eyed it cautiously. "What is it?" "Rabbit." "Wild onions." "Roots." Eat. Her first spoonful was hesitant, but then her eyes widened in surprise. "This is very good." Gideon just shrugged. Necessity had made him a better cook than any recipe book ever could. He ate his own meal in his customary silence, but when she quietly asked for a second helping, he felt a strange and unfamiliar stirring in his chest. It felt a little like pride. Afterward, her gaze went to the ladder leading to the loft. "Where will I sleep?" Gideon gestured upward with his chin. "Up there." "I'll stay down here by the fire." "That is not right." "This is your home." "Life isn't right," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. My Lin pressed her lips into a thin line but did as she was told. She climbed the ladder, moving awkwardly in the bulky trousers. Halfway up, she paused and looked down at him. "Mr. Croft." He looked up. "Thank you." "For saving my life." He gave a curt nod and turned back to the fire. He listened as she settled onto the mattress above, the faint sounds of another person in his house, a foreign intrusion. It unsettled him deeply, but it also seemed to soothe an old, aching wound he hadn't known was still open. By morning, the fury of the storm had passed, leaving behind a world of profound grey stillness. A thick, Pristine blanket of snow covered everything, hiding fences and trails. My Lin joined him at the doorway, wrapped in an old coat of Abigail's that he had taken from the trunk. She hadn't asked whose it was. She simply pulled it tight around herself and stepped into the cold. The view took her breath away. White plains stretched to an endless horizon, dotted with trees bowing under the weight of the snow. The silence was absolute. "It is as if the world has ended," she whispered in awe. "This is Wyoming," Gideon said. "The world just keeps on going, storm or no storm." She turned to him, her cheeks flushed a lovely pink from the cold. "Why would a man choose this? To live where no one else can?" Gideon's gaze met hers, his expression unreadable. "Same reason a woman might travel from China to San Francisco, I'd wager. Some things you run from, you don't ever go back for a moment." Neither spoke, the truth of his words hanging between them. Then My Lin's voice softened. "What did you run from, Mr. Croft?" His jaw clenched, and he turned his face back toward the house. "Someone I couldn't save." The words were heavy with unspoken grief. As they went back inside, My Lin understood more than he had intended to reveal, and Gideon knew, with a sinking feeling, that the blizzard outside was no longer the only storm he had to survive. 3 more days passed. The snow held them captive, piling ever higher against the walls of the ranch house. With each passing hour, the unspoken tension between Gideon and My Lin grew. She was no longer a guest but a part of the cabin's rhythm. She helped prepare meals, her movements quiet and efficient. She learned to split kindling, and even tried her hand at carving, her small, graceful hand struggling with the rough wood. She was not the same terrified woman he had pulled from the snow. There was a core of steel in her, a resilience that he felt every time her dark eyes met his across the fire. One evening, as she was concentrating on a piece of wood, the knife slipped, slicing a clean cut across her thumb. A perfect bead of blood welled up against her pale skin. Gideon was by her side in a single stride, taking her hand in his. "Hold still," she winced as he cleaned the wound with whiskey from his flask, but she did not pull away. Her hand felt small and delicate in his rough grasp. He held it for a heartbeat too long, the warmth of her skin a searing brand on his calloused palm. Their eyes locked, and in that moment, something arced between them, a current of awareness that was both dangerous and undeniable. Gideon dropped her hand as if it were a hot coal and retreated to his side of the hearth. By the next morning, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The pale sun made the snow-covered landscape glitter. Gideon saddled Fury and took My Lin out to check his trap lines. She was a quick study, her focus intense, though her hands trembled when she helped him reset a snare that held their dinner. "I understand it is necessary for survival," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I do not think I will ever find it easy. The moment it becomes easy," Gideon said, his eyes on the distant horizon, "is the moment you've lost a piece of what makes you human." She looked at him then, with a searching intensity that made him want to turn away. "Is that why you live out here alone? To hold on to what is left?" Gideon's silence was its own answer. That afternoon, on the trail back to the house, My Lin's foot slipped on a hidden patch of ice. Gideon reacted instantly, his arm snaking around her waist to break her fall. She fell back against his chest, and for a long, frozen moment, they stayed that way. Her head was tilted back, her face just inches from his, her lips slightly parted. His heart hammered against his ribs like a war drum. He pushed her away, his movements rough and abrupt. "Storm's rolling back in," he growled. "We need to go." Inside, the air crackled with unspoken feelings. Every accidental brush of their hands as they worked, every time their shoulders touched in the confined space, was like a spark landing on dry tinder, threatening to burn down the walls he had spent 15 years erecting. That night, the sound of quiet sobs drifted down from the loft. Gideon stood at the bottom of the ladder, his heart torn. Finally, he could bear it no more and climbed up. He found her sitting on the mattress, her face streaked with tears. "Everything is gone," she whispered, her voice choked with despair. "My husband, my new life, all dead. And I am trapped here with a man who saved me but who cannot bear to even look at me." The raw pain in her voice was a knife in Gideon's gut. He sat on the floor a few feet away from her. "You're not trapped," he said softly. "You're alive. And I can look at you just fine." That's the damn problem. Her tears slowed. She reached out and took his hand. "Then don't look away." Gideon squeezed his eyes shut, but her hand was warm and real in his, a lifeline in the darkness of his solitude. The next day, he finally spoke Abigail's name aloud. The story of their life, the farm, the fever, the tiny grave he dug with his own hands, poured out of him like a river breaking through a dam. Mylin listened without interruption, her eyes never leaving his face, her hand resting on his arm. When he was finished, a ragged silence filled the room. She reached up and touched his cheek, her fingers trembling. "You are not afraid of death, Gideon," she said softly. "You are terrified of living again. But I am not afraid. Not with you." He tried to pull back, to warn her away from the wreckage of his heart. But she whispered his name, and when her lips met his, 15 years of self-imposed exile shattered into 1,000 pieces. Gideon pulled her to him, kissing her with the desperate hunger of a starving man. From that moment, everything was different. For 3 days, they existed in a world of their own making, laughing as they worked, carving side by side, finding solace and passion in each other's arms at night. Gideon felt the frost around his heart begin to thaw. He felt alive again, and it was the most terrifying and wonderful feeling in the world. But in the wilderness, peace is a fleeting visitor. On the 4th morning, fury's sharp, warning whinny broke the morning calm. 3 riders were approaching on the trail. A cold dread settled in Gideon's stomach. He knew trouble on sight. He grabbed his rifle and told Mylin to hide in the loft, but she emerged from the house with his second rifle in her hands. "This is my fight now, too," she said, her jaw set. The lead rider, a well-dressed Chinese man, dismounted with an air of arrogant ownership. Mylin gasped, her face paling. "Mr. Chen," she whispered. The man's smile was as thin and cold as a razor. "Mylin, your mourning period is over. Your late husband's debts to me are considerable. You will come with me. My son is waiting." Mylin stepped forward to stand beside Gideon, her shoulders squared. "I am not a piece of property to be traded for debts. I will not marry your son." Rage twisted Chen's handsome features. He gestured to his 2 hired guns. "Take her." The sharp crack of Gideon's rifle echoed through the valley. One of the men crumpled to the snow. The other dove for cover. Chen drew a pistol, but before he could aim, a second shot rang out. He cried out in pain as Mylin's bullet tore through his hand, sending his pistol flying. Her voice shook, but her aim had been true. "The next one will be in your chest." The fight was over as quickly as it had begun. The remaining hired gun threw down his weapon. Chen clutched his bleeding hand, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. "You will regret choosing this barbarian. You could have had a life of ease." Mylin's dark eyes blazed with a fire Gideon had never seen. "I already have everything that matters." Chen fled, his shouted threat swallowed by the vast silence of the plains. The snow began to fall again, softly covering his tracks. The world was quiet once more. The rifle slipped from Mylin's trembling hands. The delayed shock hit her, and she began to shake uncontrollably. Gideon was there in an instant, wrapping his arms around her, holding her tight. "You did it," he murmured into her hair. "You saved us." Tears streamed down her face. "I did not think I could be so strong." "You're stronger than anyone I've ever known," Gideon said, his own voice thick with emotion. "Strong enough to make me believe again." Weeks later, as the first signs of spring touched the land, they stood before a traveling justice of the peace in the small town of Cedar Ridge. Mylin wore a simple borrowed dress, a spray of early wildflowers tucked into her dark hair. Gideon, clean-shaven for the first time in years, spoke vows he never thought he would say again. When he said the words, "I do," they carried the weight of every solitary year, every broken hope, finally made whole. Back at the ranch, their small house became a home. The wooden horses still stood on the mantel, but they no longer spoke of loneliness. They spoke of a herd of 2, of survival, of finding a home in the most unexpected of places. And that night, when Mylin laid her head on Gideon's chest and whispered, I choose you, every day, no matter what comes. Gideon knew the simple truth. He had once warned her he couldn't control himself around her. Now, that wasn't a warning. It was a promise. They had both been lost, wandering their own broken paths. But in the heart of the storm, against the cruelty of men and the ghosts of their pasts, they had found their way home to each other.